So next session, we are looking at more on a compliance, how the CSR, and from the perspective of an advisor, from the perspective of an auditor, or a perfect perspective of somebody who would give an advice on what the challenges are and how to ensure that the CSR is met as per the expectation of the regulation, as well as per the philosophy or the committee that decides on how to spend, what to spend, where to spend, and within what time to spend. So I have with me my partner Divyang Desai. Divyang Desai is a partner at Deloitte. He has been a very senior, I would say, advisory partner. He has 7 years that he has spent at Deloitte and 9 years at Ernst & Young. And also he does quite a all-round work in terms of creating standard operating processes, internal audit of the company, risk advisory area. And he's based out of Ahmedabad now. Earlier he was in Mumbai. I also have Vivek to support. Vivek, you can join us on the dais also, doesn't matter. We can move one of the who has been a senior man. Vivek, you were involved in any of the AMA thing? No, earlier. Okay. And he is also part of the risk advisory as a director. And thanks Divyang for accepting our invitation. We would like you to give perspective of compliance and the care to be taken in terms of the CSR. And of course, to do the honors, we would like to welcome Divyang.
Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Divyang.
Thank you, Soundbite, for the introduction, and good morning, friends. The topic that I will cover is on the entire compliance piece. What is the legal framework, and what are the key amendments in the recent past, and what are the process policy the company corporate follows in order to ensure compliance with the CSR. So overall, we will talk on the legal framework, what are the components of the framework, what is an approach that a corporate and NGO follows, what are the key risks and fraud in the entire CSR, which every corporate and NGO needs to look into, because this fraud is imminent across various facets of the entire approach. And the recent amendment and what trends we have seen in CSR compliance, that also we'll talk. And on the CSR initiative, what we have seen in other companies, that will bring a flavor to that. The first is the legal framework. It's nothing but what is the amount that a company needs to invest or company needs to allocate for the CSR perspective. The entire CSR policy and the framework that company needs to implement, and the entire CSR committee, which is the governing body who implements the CSR policy of the company. Now, if you divide the entire framework, it comes into 4 pillars. One is applicability, to which corporate it is applicable based on turnover, based on net profit, and based on your overall turnover of a company. So one is to understand the applicability of the act and how do one ensure that a specific corporate compliance with the CSR regulation. The second is what is the implication of a non-compliance? Very critical, because if you don't comply, what are the penalties to the company? What are the penalties to the officer who is involved in that overall CSR activity? One is a board, the highest authority of the company needs to report into the annual report why CSR has not been invested by the company. And the reason has to be very specific. The second is in terms of financial penalty will be imposed by the authorities. Third is on the officer, a designated officer who is responsible for CSR. So these are the areas of the non-compliance. The second are the CSR committee responsibility. It has to be 3 to 4 member team, of which one has to be independent director. Why independent director? So that they can oversee the function of a CSR policy, implementation of the policy, and on a day-to-day basis, how the policy has been implemented by the company, and report to the board on the effectiveness of the implementation. And the board responsibility will be on a very high level, saying that who should be the member of the CSR committee, what should be the policy of the company, what should be the protocol of implementation, at the same time reviewing the effectiveness of the CSR spends. And the fourth is on the overall responsibility of the board in terms of responsibility. So the 4 important components of a CSR from the company perspective is One is applicability, second is CSR committee, and the overall board responsibility on ensuring that the CSR committee implements the policy as per the compliance requirement. Now, if we divide what are the type of CSR activities a company can undertake, we can divide this into three buckets. One is the entire poverty eradication, slum development, and the providing the health and nutrition to the people at a very lower strata of the income. The second is entire providing the gender equality. The third is funding technology towards education, training, sports, and also protecting the heritage and culture. So Schedule 7 is very clear that what activities can be undertaken by CSR. Every company has to minutely understand the requirement and identify the implementation agency or agency which are into these activities. Because one has to really understand the nuances and the objective of the NGO who's implementing this specific activity. Because any non-compliance will directly impact the company as well as the NGO. So one is not only applicability to where the CSR is applicable to company, one is to also understand what are the activities being undertaken by the company and how a company can implement the same. What are the tax consideration? What are the benefits for a company? One is contribution based or a project based. It's very clear that under IT, there are various benefits available with the company as far as CSR is concerned. One is the company's access, what amount the company has to invest, but at the same time, there are benefits on the company's income tax also. So it's not only that the government is imposing that the company has to implement CSR, at the same time there are benefits, the taxation also. The company, whenever they implement CSR, they need to understand what are the best benefit a company can get from the taxation perspective and accordingly identify the various schemes and the implementation program. The next is most important, the governance framework. For a company, not only understanding a policy is critical, but the tone at the top, that is from the board to senior management and from senior management to the team who is implementing CSR. So one is your strategic direction, second is an oversight function, the third is the enablers that will help you to implement the CSR. So if you divide these three, the first is the strategy. The board has to identify what programs and what is the activity that the company will undertake from the CSR perspective. Second is a oversight structure, which is nothing but a governance structure, like a CSR committee, who will oversight the functional team responsibility from the CSR perspective, and they report to the board on the implementation of this. And next, all other enablers in terms of policy, procedure, SOPs, tools, which will help you to monitor on an ongoing basis how the CSR activity with the company has been implemented, how do you report back to the board on the non-compliances, how do you report what on the effectiveness of the CSR program, what are the benefits the company has got because of CSR, and in terms of program, how it has really benefited the group to which the CSR program has been implemented. So it's very critical that not only the committee has to be formed, but you need to also have policies and procedure and a governing structure to implement the entire CSR program. Because unless there will be there is intention to implement, but if it will be implemented in a very haphazard manner, and there could be chances that a company will not implement a threshold limit amount into CSR. So though the board would like to implement it, but if the enablers are not available in the company, will not be able to implement the CSR. The third is, how do you implement in CSR? What should be the overall approach? The one is a commitment. The second is an assess and define. So one is, what is the commitment of the board to implement the CSR? How do you define it in terms of policy, procedure, tools, framework, role, responsibility? How do you assess? How do you identify the need of the business? How do you identify need of the company to implement, or to identify a implementation partner to implement the CSR? The third is the entire implementation of the CSR activity. And the fourth is entire communication, internal as well as external. Internal, the reason being how the policies were implemented, and external to the world, saying how company is implementing policy, what activities has been undertaken by the company, what are the benefits that the society has got because of the implementation by the company. So the reporting internally, and communication to the external world is very critical. So these 6 parameters help the company to implement the entire CSR program. Now, what are the, even the company has a best policy, you have a very good independent team who oversee the implementation, but there are certain risks of fraud which are inherent in any implementation of the program. This is applicable to every company, and this is based on our actual experience when we have seen the implementation at various companies in India, which is either an MNC or a listed entity or a private organization. The first is your CSR committee. Though it requires a more than 3-member team and one has to be independent, but when you see the composition of the CSR committee member, one has to identify, is there any conflict of interest of any director while identifying the implementation program? Is there any conflict of interest of any director in investing into an NGO? Or there is any conflict of interest of a director or relative of a director in this program? Though you have a very good policy structure, but if you do not identify, you will have a problem implementing this program. And this actually we have seen in many companies when the CSR was implemented at the initial stage when the companies had came into existence. And still we have seen these issues, though director may not be aware of the conflict of interest. But as a company, as an officer who implement has to educate to the CSR committee. There could be an indirect relationship through which there will be a conflict of interest. So one has to really flag such issues, discuss with the board, discuss with CSR committee, and ensure that this is implemented at the top. The second is the entire strategy and policy. It should not look like an advertisement or a brand promotion activity. You may invest the amount that is required by the act, but it may seen as a brand promotion of a company. So company may be investing into an NGO, but it's an indirect benefit that the company is getting through a communication, through advertisement, through a brand promotion activity. That has to be stopped. The third is identification of a partner. You may identify implementation partner, same as a conflict of interest. You may see that a partner is associated either with a board of director or independent director or a committee, or he may relate to any officer in the company, which is KMP. So the implementation partner, the entire structure, role, responsibility has to understand and to correlate with this. And that requires the independent party to check that there is no conflict of interest as far as the partner is concerned. The third is entire bribery, corruption, and inflated project. You may see that the actual cost is inflated. When you compare the implementation, though company has invested, but you see the cost incurred versus what is reported, there will be huge difference. That is why the actual cost is inflated by the implementation partner, by the officer who is involved. So one has to really understand what was the cost that was agreed, how the cost has been identified to be incurred, what are the supporting documents that demonstrate that this is an actual amount that has been implemented. There are many fictitious projects that we have seen. There is actual example when on a document it is seen that we will invest this X number of projects into a remote location of either in any part of India, but when you actually see either the number of projects are less than what is committed or projects are non-existent. This is also a case where on a document a company may communicate that there is a number of projects being implemented by the company, but actually the projects are non-existent. There are documents which are, sorry to use the word fabricated, the documents will say that this has been implemented, but when you actually go and see, the real projects are not in existence. So you require a third party agency, an independent person to verify the implementation of the effectiveness of the CSR program. Because the company may run the risk of either the actual cost is much less than what has been reported, or the actual program is not at all implemented by the company. And the last is all financial related frauds, where either you have inflated bills or you have a bill which is not at all implemented, or that could be a certain contracts, purchase order, which are normally not related to the activities being implemented. So these are the frauds that we have actually seen in many companies where agency, not agency, but the people who are at the ground who are implementing, they may submit document or they may submit evidences which are not related to the real program. So such risk of fraud one has to identify at a very early stage, have a tools, enablers, and the identification of such areas upfront, and do this review on an ongoing basis. Because unless an officer who is responsible will not identify this, it may impact the image of the company also, then brand and reputation of the company. So these are important areas that one has to look into. Implement the review of the effectiveness of the spend. It's like a fraud risk assessment. The potential risk, it may not have in place, but it's important that such reviews has to be done by the company on an ongoing basis. Now we'll talk on the recent amendments. The first amendment which has come recently in September 2020 is a new requirement has been added to CSR amendment policy. The company that has amount outstanding in its unspent CSR shall constitute a committee and comply with the relevant provision. So if the amount is not spent by the company, the same rules of a committee and will be applicable to the unspent amount also. In the earlier session, we just heard that how if the amount unspent, we have to contribute to the PM fund. Similarly, whatever amount which is left over, the same review mechanism will be applicable. CSR committee will review this and they will guide the company on compliance fees. The second relates to the entire Rule 2 has been now been omitted. This now requires that many implementation agency has been now been identified by the government which can be considered as an implementation agency, but the objective should be all the trust or a fund or institution. The objective should be non-profit. The objective should be for the social cause, non-profit, then they can be considered as an implementation partner, as an implementation agency from the CSR implementation perspective. So the new amendment classifies this, that this institution can be classified as an implementation agency, but the objective has to be for social cause and non-profit, including university. It should be non-profit, including hospital, it should be non-profit. So hospital, institution, fund, they are recognized as an implementation partner, but main objective of that should be non-profit and for social cause, they can be considered as an implementation partner. And the last amendment was to how do you book expenditure during the impact assessment, now with amendment in terms of threshold limit. Earlier it was 5% and now it is 2%, and it is earlier it was whichever is less, now it is whichever is higher of 50 lakhs. So amount of expenditure which has been considered we can book as an expense, that is a new amendment has been come into the picture. And the entire disclosure of the CSR spend, so the board has to report on the CSR, the disclosure requirements that any unspent amount has to be also report, and how the unspent amount has been reported, how the company has dealt with the unspent amount has to be disclosed in the board report. These are the trends that we have seen in CSR compliance, and this is mostly in terms of global companies and large Indian companies, where the thrust is more on the, I will say, on the green energy, on the social impact. So if you see all electric infrastructure, so companies are now investing more on the companies which are into development of infrastructure which is non-electric, taking initiatives for the clean air. So companies which are involved in such activity, companies are now investing CSR into such companies. Climate change disclosures, the companies who are more robust in disclosing the climate change, those companies, companies are now investing. So focus of CSR has also changed from the normal activity of Schedule 7. The companies which are involved in green energy, companies which are involved in sustainability, companies which are involved in ESG. So thrust is more on environment, social cause, and for the upliftment of the society. The focus has now changed, and many companies globally are focusing on such initiatives. And the last is on the CSR initiatives, which is just a list of various initiatives which we have seen in companies over the last period, 5 to 7 years. The focus mostly companies on the health, nutrition, and sanitation. Most of the companies CSR are on these areas, followed by education, and very limited on the sports and environment. If you see the spends by the companies more on the health, Second is on education, very limited in sports and very limited on green energy. But the trend in last 2 years has changed, where focus is now more on green energy, sustainability. Sports is still a neglected sector in India, and the vocational training also has been neglected sector. So though the trust of the government is that you should focus more on the sports activity, focus more on making an environment clean, have a clean air, but companies are still focusing on only on health and nutrition, because it's like one company is following, the other 10 follows that company. There is no new initiative by the company to identify which are the new avenues where a company can invest. So one has to really deep dive into and what are the new avenues and identify such areas and advise the board and CSR committee that these are the 5 new areas and companies should invest into it. I would close my presentation with any questions. I would be happy to answer that.
And thanks. I think Divyang, very, very elaborate presentation. Thank you very much. And I'm happy that he presented the whole thing, but he took the crux out of the presentation, and then that was very helpful. But very important, I think some of the things that he started with governance was covered with Parag Bhai's also. But the trends, the frauds that can happen, the corruption can happen through this, because you are trying to give money to somewhere where the politicians are involved, etc. And so this fraud space is very important, and then the impact and measurement, and certainly it is the purpose ultimately. Schedule 7 is sacrosanct, no choice about it. Yeah. That we'll figure out if we can do some presentation out there. So thank you, Divyang. Thanks, Vivek, for joining the conference.